made with spoken Tyrus by Paul Price Tyne Ale 38. Chapter 1. The Awakening. The wind howled a mournful dirge across the desolate fields of Nebraska, whipping against the weathered clapboard of the farmhouse. Inside, a young tyrus, no older than 7, huddled beneath the covers of his bed, his small body trembling not from the cold, but from a terror that seeped into his very bones. The nightmares had begun subtly, fleeting images of shadowy figures flitting at the periphery of his vision, whispers that slithered into his ears, carrying promises of unspeakable things. They were now relentless, vivid tapestries of fear woven from the darkest threads of his subconscious. He'd wake in a cold sweat, heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his breath catching in his throat. The smell of dust and decay, perpetually clinging to the old farmhouse, clung to him even in his waking hours, a constant reminder of the oppressive silence that seemed to permeate every corner of his existence. His parents, distant figures consumed by their own silent struggles, offered little solace. Their faces, etched with lines of weariness and unspoken pain, were rarely turned towards him, their attention consumed by an unseen weight that pressed down upon them. The farmhouse itself felt like a character in his own personal horror story, its decaying timbers groaning under the weight of secrets, its empty rooms echoing with the ghosts of forgotten sorrows. One recurring nightmare stood out above the rest, a vast metallic structure, a labyrinth of cold, sterile corridors that stretched into an infinite darkness. Within its chilling embrace he saw children, pale, gaunt figures with vacant eyes, subjected to unspeakable procedures, their cries muffled by the relentless hum of machinery. He couldn't quite grasp the details, but the sheer terror of the vision clung to him like a shroud. These fleeting glimpses were not just nightmares. They were premonitions, fragmented prophecies of a future he couldn't comprehend but instinctively feared. The isolation was profound. The nearest town was miles away, a distant speck on the horizon, offering little more than a sense of unattainable escape. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, all marked by a monotonous rhythm of solitude punctuated by the sporadic sounds of distant farm machinery and the relentless cry of the wind. His only companions were the shadows that danced in the corners of his eyes and the whispering voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his confinement. Even in his waking hours, strange things happened. Objects would move inexplicably, a book falling from a shelf, a chair shifting across the floor. His parents, attributing these occurrences to drafts or his own clumsy movements, paid them little heed. But Tyrus knew instinctively that it wasn't him. A power, subtle yet undeniable, stirred within him, a nascent ability he couldn't control, a force both terrifying and exhilarating. He felt a strange connection to the wind, to the earth, to the very fabric of the universe, a connection that felt both beautiful and terrifying. He could often feel the emotions of others, their fears and anxieties weaving through the air, invisible threads binding him to their worlds. He'd try to tell his parents about the nightmares, about the moving objects, about the strange feelings that overwhelmed him. Their responses were always the same, a weary sigh, a dismissive wave of the hand, or an admonishment to be quiet, to stop imagining things. These dismissals solidified his sense of isolation, further deepening the chasm between himself and the outside world. The silence became a suffocating blanket, the darkness a constant companion. One day, while exploring the attic, a dusty, forgotten space filled with relics of a past he barely understood, he discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside, nestled within a tarnished silver locket, was a small, intricately carved wooden amulet. The amulet bore a symbol he'd never seen before, a complex geometric pattern radiating a strange power, a sense of ancient and unsettling energy. The moment his fingers brushed against its cold surface, a wave of dizziness washed over him, followed by a kaleidoscope of images that flooded his mind, the metallic structure from his nightmares, the terrified faces of children, the shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. The vision was far more detailed this time. He saw himself, as if from outside his body, standing before the immense structure. The building was not just a metal construct, but a seemingly living entity pulsating with an unnatural energy. He saw flashes of laboratories filled with gleaming technology, hear the rhythmic whirring of cloning machines, and smell the sharp, acrid scent of chemicals. He saw children, not just pale and gaunt, but with eyes that held a strange, unsettling luminescence, eyes that seemed to know more than they should. The shadowy figures moved with an unnatural grace, their actions deliberate and cold. They were not human. The vision ended abruptly, leaving him gasping for breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He clutched the amulet, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that this was no ordinary symbol, that it held the key to a mystery far greater than he could comprehend. The farmhouse, his prison, now felt less like a refuge and more like a cage, a fragile barrier protecting him from something both vast and terrifying, something that was beginning to feel intimately connected to his own existence. The wind continued its mournful song, but now it carried a different tone, a subtle undercurrent of warning, a premonition of the storm that was about to break. The amulet, a cold weight in his hand, became a symbol of his destiny, a destiny as terrifying as it was inescapable. His childhood, once defined by quiet isolation and recurring nightmares, was now the opening scene of a horrifying truth, a prelude to a life inextricably linked to a conspiracy far older than time itself. The isolated farmhouse was not just a place, but a crucible, where his psychic powers were forged in the fires of trauma and isolation, preparing him for a destiny he could not yet fathom, a destiny that would soon tear him from his secluded world and thrust him into the heart of a global conspiracy. Years blurred into a hazy montage of fear and isolation. The amulet, a constant companion, became more than just a relic. It was a conduit, a key unlocking fragments of his past and glimpses of a future both terrifying and inevitable. He learned to control, to a degree, the power surging within him, the ability to manipulate objects with his mind, to sense the emotions of those around him, even at a distance. But the visions continued, intensifying, becoming more vivid, more disturbing. One sweltering summer afternoon, while examining the amulet in the weak sunlight that filtered through the attic window, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his left forearm. He instinctively looked down, and a gasp escaped his lips. Branded onto his skin, etched as if by fire, was a symbol. It was identical to the one carved into the wooden amulet, a complex geometric pattern radiating a chilling aura of power. It was not a superficial mark. It felt deeply embedded, an intrinsic part of him, as if woven into the very fabric of his being. Panic seized him. He tried to scrub it away, but the symbol remained, unyielding, a permanent fixture on his flesh. A wave of dizziness washed over him, more intense than any he'd experienced before. His vision swam, the world dissolving into a kaleidoscope of swirling colors and disorienting shapes. Then, the visions began. This time, they were not fleeting glimpses. They were immersive experiences, as if he were actually living the scenes unfolding before his eyes. He saw the metallic structure from his nightmares in breathtaking detail. It wasn't just a building. It was a monolith, a colossal structure of gleaming metal and glass, stretching towards the sky like a grotesque, futuristic skyscraper. It was named Aquan, he somehow knew. The name echoed in his mind, resonating with a primal fear. Inside Aquan, he saw laboratories filled with advanced technology, far beyond anything he could comprehend. He saw rows upon rows of cloning chambers, humming with a sinister energy, their glass doors revealing pale, ethereal figures suspended in liquid. These were the children from his nightmares, their faces gaunt, their eyes vacant, yet somehow imbued with an unsettling luminescence. They weren't merely clones, they possessed an uncanny intelligence, a knowingness that belied their age. The shadowy figures he'd seen in his earlier visions were now clearly visible. They weren't human, not entirely. They moved with an unnerving grace, their actions precise and deliberate, their eyes cold and calculating. They wore dark, flowing robes, their faces obscured by deep hoods, but their aura exuded an aura of malevolent power. They seemed to be overseeing the cloning process, guiding the scientists, their presence radiating an oppressive sense of authority. He saw children being kidnapped, their screams muffled, their terrified faces contorted in silent agony. They were snatched from their homes, from playgrounds, from the very streets they walked. The kidnappers moved with the efficiency of trained operatives, their actions swift and brutal, leaving no trace behind. He saw a glimpse of a symbol on their vehicles, a stylized serpent coiled around a crucifix, a perverse parody of religious iconography. The visions were interspersed with flashes of other scenes, ancient texts, arcane rituals, clandestine meetings in dimly lit rooms, whispered conversations laced with religious jargon and coded language. He saw a symbol again, but this time it wasn't the symbol on his arm, but an alternative symbol, a complex interweaving of geometric shapes and arcane symbols, deeply intertwined with the symbolism of the serpent and the crucifix. The fragmented visions hinted at a vast conspiracy, a centuries-old plot involving religious sects, powerful organizations, and even governments. He saw hints of the Jesuit order, their influence seemingly woven into the fabric of this clandestine operation. The scale of the operation left him breathless. It was a network spanning continents, shrouded in secrecy and deceit. The visions culminated in a single, horrifying scene, a ritualistic ceremony inside a kwan. The children, now grown, stood in a circle, their luminescent eyes fixated on a single figure at the center. This figure, shrouded in darkness, possessed an aura of immense power, a palpable aura of evil. They were creating something terrifying, something that felt deeply connected to biblical prophecies of the Antichrist. The visions ended abruptly, leaving Tyrus gasping for breath, his body drenched in cold sweat. The pain in his arm intensified, spreading like a wildfire through his veins. He clutched the amulet, its cold surface a small comfort in the face of the overwhelming terror that threatened to consume him. The symbol on his arm burned, a fiery brand of destiny, a mark that bound him to this conspiracy, a conspiracy that reached far beyond the isolated farmhouse in Nebraska. Days turned into weeks, and the visions continued to plague him, their intensity increasing with each passing day. He felt a pull, an almost irresistible urge to uncover the truth behind the conspiracy. He understood now. The amulet, the symbol, the visions, they weren't just random occurrences. They were elements of a larger plan, a terrifying puzzle he was destined to solve. His isolated childhood, once a source of immense pain, was now revealed as a necessary preparation, a crucible forging his psychic abilities, preparing him for a conflict far beyond his wildest imaginations. The power within him grew stronger, but so did the dangers. He sensed a presence, watching him, following him. He felt their eyes upon him, their presence as palpable as the amulet in his hand. He wasn't alone. The government agents mentioned in his visions, Sam Stanton and Mary Octavia, were real. He started to catch glimpses of them in his periphery, fleeting shadows at the edge of his awareness. And then there was the priest, Thomas. He seemed to be a force of countervailing power, sensing his struggle and potentially offering guidance. He knew that exposing this conspiracy would cost him dearly, that he was walking a path fraught with danger. Yet he couldn't ignore the growing dread, the looming threat to countless lives, the insidious plan to unleash something truly terrifying upon the world. The symbol on his arm was a constant reminder of his destiny, a symbol of his power, and a symbol of the immense price he would have to pay. The isolated farmhouse in Nebraska was far behind him. He was now embroiled in a fight for survival, a fight against forces far greater than himself, a fight to prevent the prophecy from coming true. The truth, he knew, was a perilous journey, one that could cost him everything, but he had to try. He had to uncover the secret of Aquan, and he had to stop them. The fate of the world might well depend on it. The rain hammered the corrugated iron roofs of the alleyway, a relentless percussion accompanying the frantic beat of Tyrus's heart. The air hung thick with the smell of stale beer, rotting garbage, and something else. Something metallic and faintly ozone-like, a scent that clung to the edges of his awareness and set his teeth on edge. He'd been following the shadowy figure for hours, a relentless pursuit born of instinct and a premonition heavy as a tombstone. The figure, tall and gaunt, moved with an unnatural grace, slipping through the urban labyrinth like a phantom. He was sure it was one of the hooded figures from his visions, a harbinger of the coming storm. He rounded a corner, the alley narrowing to a claustrophobic passage barely wide enough for two people. The rain streamed down his face, obscuring his vision, blurring the already indistinct shapes and shadows. Then he saw him. The man stood with his back against a brick wall, his shoulders hunched as if bearing the weight of the world. Rain slicked his dark hair, clinging to the collar of his worn leather jacket. He was older than Tyrus had expected, his face etched with lines of weariness and cynicism, his eyes, the only feature visible beneath the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat, holding a chilling intensity. A government-issued Glock 17 was holstered at his hip, its presence a stark reminder of the dangerous game Tyrus was playing. This was Sam Stanton. He knew it instinctively, a recognition that transcended sight or sound, a knowing that settled deep in his bones. The name, whispered in the visions, now resonated with a chilling certainty. Sam Stanton, the government agent who'd been watching him, the silent observer in the wings.
"You've been following me,"
Tyrus said, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the relentless downpour. Stanton didn't turn. He remained motionless, a statue carved from shadows and rain. Silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The tension in the air crackled, palpable as a physical force. Tyrus felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being observed by more than just Stanton. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was a deliberate meeting, orchestrated by forces far beyond his comprehension. Finally, Stanton turned, slowly, deliberately. His eyes, cold and calculating, bored into Tyrus, piercing the veil of the rain. They held a flicker of something akin to recognition, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of a shared secret, a common enemy.
"You know more than you let on, kid,"
Stanton said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, barely audible above the storm. He didn't pull his weapon. It seemed there was something else at play here, some sort of unspoken understanding.
"I've been watching you for a while, Aquan."
The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Tyrus felt a surge of adrenaline, a potent cocktail of fear and exhilaration. He'd been discovered. He'd been found. But by whom? And why?
"How much do you know?"
Tyrus countered, his voice steadier than he felt. Sam Stanton chuckled, a harsh, dry sound.
"Let's just say I know enough to be very, very interested. I know about the visions. I know about the symbol."
He gestured vaguely towards Tyrus's forearm, where the branded symbol pulsed faintly beneath his rain-soaked shirt.
"And I know about the children."
The air crackled with unspoken truths, with veiled threats and hidden alliances. The rain continued to fall, a curtain shielding them from the prying eyes of the city. They were alone, bound together by a shared secret, a dangerous knowledge that put them both in the crosshairs of a powerful, shadowy organization.
"They're not just children,"
Tyrus corrected, his voice low and intense.
"They're different. They're Nephilim."
Sam Stanton's eyes narrowed. The word, ancient and ominous, seemed to resonate deeply within him. He knew instinctively that this was a word reserved for those who had stumbled upon the most dangerous and forbidden knowledge.
"Nephilim,"
Stanton repeated, testing the word on his tongue.
"I've heard whispers, legends, but this is something else. This is real."
He paused, his gaze drifting towards the dark recesses of the alleyway.
"They're cloning them, aren't they? Creating an army? Or something worse?"
Tyrus nodded, the weight of his knowledge pressing down on him. He recounted his visions, the horrifying details of the cloning facility, the chilling experiments, the ritualistic ceremonies. He spoke of the serpent and the crucifix, of the perverse parody of religious iconography, of the shadowy figures in dark robes, and the unsettling aura of malevolent power emanating from them. He spoke of the Jesuit order's involvement, their influence woven into the very fabric of this conspiracy. Sam Stanton listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer commentary, he simply absorbed the information, his silence more intimidating than any outburst could have been. When Tyrus finished, a long silence hung between them, punctuated only by the relentless rain. Then Stanton spoke, his voice devoid of its previous cynicism.
"I'm not here to arrest you, kid."
Stanton said, his voice unexpectedly soft.
"Not yet, anyway, but they're watching us, both of us. They know we're onto them."
He looked around, his eyes scanning the dark, rain-slicked alley.
"This is a war, Tyrus. A war you didn't ask for, but one you're now inextricably involved in, and we need each other."
He extended a hand, his palm open, a gesture of reluctant alliance in the face of overwhelming odds. It wasn't a friendly gesture, it was a strategic one, a recognition that their survival depended on mutual cooperation. It was a fragile truce in a war against forces that dwarfed their individual capabilities. Tyrus looked at Stanton's outstretched hand, then back into the man's cold, calculating eyes. He saw not only a seasoned government agent, but a man burdened by a heavy secret, a man who, despite his initial hostility, recognized the scale of the impending threat. The hand represented a choice, a perilous path into the heart of a conspiracy so vast, so terrifying, that it defied comprehension. He hesitated, a flicker of fear battling with a stronger, more urgent instinct, the desperate need to stop the horrifying plan unfolding before his eyes. The rain continued to fall, washing away the grime and the shadows, revealing the stark reality of their situation. They were two men against a tide of unimaginable evil, a desperate alliance forged in the darkness of a rain-soaked alleyway. The fate of countless children and perhaps the world itself rested on their shoulders. He placed his hand in Stanton's, the cold, damp skin a surprising comfort, a tangible link in the face of an invisible enemy. Their pact was sealed, not by words, but by the shared weight of their knowledge, the shared burden of their destiny. The fight had begun, and they were in this together. The damp chill of the alley clung to Tyrus even after he and Stanton had left its claustrophobic embrace. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the tension remained, a taut wire stretched between them. Stanton, despite his gruff exterior and the Glock still nestled at his hip, seemed relieved. The weight of unspoken knowledge shared between them had forged an unlikely alliance, a precarious truce against an unseen enemy.
"We need to find out more,"
Stanton said, his voice low as they walked towards a nondescript black sedan parked a few blocks away.
"About this bloodline, about the Nephilim."
The car was unmarked, its interior smelling of leather and old coffee. Stanton drove, his gaze steady on the road, while Tyrus wrestled with the revelation of his own ancestry. The visions, once fragmented and confusing, now coalesced into a terrifyingly clear picture. He wasn't just an ordinary man caught in a conspiracy. He was a key player, a descendant of a lineage tied directly to the ancient prophecies he'd dismissed as mere folklore. His search began not in clandestine laboratories or shadowy government facilities, but in the hushed reverence of dusty archives and forgotten libraries. He immersed himself in ancient texts, deciphering cryptic passages, tracing bloodlines through centuries of obscured records. The Vatican Library, with its vaulted ceilings and the weight of centuries pressing down, became his sanctuary and his battlefield. He spent weeks poring over forgotten manuscripts, his fingers tracing faded ink, his mind piecing together fragments of a horrifying puzzle. He unearthed references to the Nephilim, not as mere mythical giants, but as a genetically manipulated lineage, a bloodline imbued with both human and something else. Something ancient, something powerful, something undeniably sinister. The text spoke of forbidden knowledge, of rituals conducted under the guise of religious observance, of a clandestine society manipulating human genetics for millennia. One particularly disturbing manuscript, bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of incense and decay, detailed the lineage of several families, their bloodlines meticulously tracked across generations. The names were cryptic, often encoded or disguised, but the pattern was undeniable. Specific family crests, symbols interwoven with religious iconography, and precise dates marked the births of individuals who seemed to possess extraordinary abilities, marked by both immense power and a profound darkness. It was an inheritance fraught with peril and responsibility. Among those names, Tyrus found his own, his family name, traced back through centuries, leading to a shocking realization. He was a direct descendant of one of these individuals, a lineage long hidden, carefully preserved, and manipulated by the same shadowy organization Stanton had alluded to. His family's history wasn't one of quiet obscurity. It was a tapestry woven with threads of power, intrigue, and unspeakable horror. They weren't just ordinary people. They were custodians of a secret, a dangerous secret that had been passed down for generations, carefully guarded and whispered in hushed tones within the family. He found accounts of his ancestors, individuals with extraordinary physical and mental capabilities, but also with an undeniable darkness clinging to them, a shadowed legacy they seemed unable to escape. His research also revealed a more insidious truth. The cloning experiments, the creation of an army of genetically modified children Nephilim, wasn't a new endeavor. It was a continuation of a practice stretching back centuries, a chilling progression of scientific and religious manipulation. The Jesuit order, as Stanton had suspected, was deeply involved, its influence woven into the very fabric of this conspiracy. Their involvement wasn't merely a coincidence, it represented a systematic manipulation of religious authority to further their sinister goals. The Jesuit order, a powerful force with a history stretching back to the 16th century, was much more than a religious institution. It had always operated within the shadows, cultivating influence in the corridors of power, accumulating vast wealth, and controlling information on a global scale. The archival evidence hinted at a darker agenda, a hidden hand guiding the levers of power throughout history. The documents revealed a historical connection between the order and other influential figures and organizations, a network of control extending through governments, financial institutions, and even scientific communities. The order wasn't merely preserving ancient secrets, it was actively creating them, manipulating global events to serve its hidden objectives. It was a conspiracy on a scale that dwarfed anything Tyrus could have ever imagined. His research uncovered a pattern of manipulating religious symbology, twisting Christian iconography into a perverse parody of faith. The serpent and the crucifix, symbols of both temptation and redemption, were repeatedly featured in the documents, highlighting a twisted mirroring of Christian principles and beliefs to justify the creation and control of these genetically modified beings. The religious element wasn't a mere superficial layer, it was the foundation, the justification, the mask used to conceal their nefarious plans. As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, a horrifying picture emerged. The clandestine society wasn't merely creating an army of genetically enhanced children. They were attempting to resurrect something far more ancient and terrifying, a grotesque perversion of biblical prophecy, a twisted attempt to usher in a new era of dominance. They were creating not merely soldiers, but the foundations for a new world order, a new world that wasn't guided by divine principles, but by the darkest desires of the human heart. Days blurred into weeks as Tyrus delved deeper into the rabbit hole, fueled by a potent mixture of fear, adrenaline, and a growing sense of responsibility. He emerged from the libraries and archives a changed man, bearing the weight of centuries of secrets, the knowledge of a conspiracy so vast and so terrifying that it threatened to shatter the very fabric of reality. He now understood the true scope of his destiny. His involvement in the conflict wasn't a random occurrence. He was a player in a game far older and more sinister than anyone could have ever imagined. He was a descendant of a bloodline directly tied to the unfolding catastrophe, a bloodline he was now tasked with stopping. The fight had begun, and he was far from prepared for what came next. But with Stanton by his side, he faced the future, however terrifying, with a newfound resolve. The alliance, forged in the rain-soaked alleyway, was now a lifeline, a critical partnership in a war against unimaginable darkness. The weight of centuries pressed down on Tyrus, a physical burden mirroring the crushing weight of the revelation he'd uncovered. He wasn't just a descendant of a powerful, albeit sinister, bloodline. He was something more, something different. The realization came not through another ancient text, not through a meticulously crafted family tree, but through a cryptic message delivered in a way that defied logic and reason. It started with a flicker, a subtle disturbance in the periphery of his vision, a shimmering, iridescent haze that seemed to emanate from the very air around him. It wasn't a hallucination. It felt more like a resonance, a vibration that resonated deep within his very being. The haze coalesced, forming letters, words, a message etched in shimmering light, a language he somehow understood without conscious effort. The message was brief, stark, and chillingly precise. Indigo child, awaken, the time is now. The phrase indigo child lingered in his mind, a key unlocking a door to a hidden chamber of his own consciousness. He'd encountered the term before, a fleeting mention in some obscure New Age literature, dismissed as mere pseudoscience. But now, in the context of his newfound knowledge, the phrase took on a terrifying new significance. It wasn't a label, it was a declaration, a statement of his unique capabilities. The following days were a blur of self-discovery, a terrifying and exhilarating journey into the unknown. He began to experience things he couldn't explain, sensations he couldn't comprehend. His senses sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. He could hear conversations from across the street, smell the faintest trace of fear on someone's breath, feel the subtle shift in the Earth's magnetic field. He also felt an almost uncanny ability to perceive emotions, to sense the hidden currents of thought and feeling that flowed beneath the surface of human interaction. One night, while alone in his apartment, a surge of energy pulsed through him, leaving him breathless and trembling. He closed his eyes and the world around him shifted. He saw colors that lay beyond the visible spectrum, felt energies he couldn't name, and sensed connections he couldn't understand. It was an overwhelming experience, a sensory overload that bordered on the mystical. He began to realize his latent abilities weren't merely heightened senses. They were something far more profound, a psychic connection to the world around him. He could project his thoughts, sending subtle suggestions into the minds of others, influencing their behavior without them even being aware of his presence. He could perceive subtle energy fields that emanated from living beings, a form of bioenergetic aura reading that allowed him to assess a person's health, emotions, and even their intentions. His ability to influence the probability field itself, to subtly shift the odds in his favor, became disturbingly apparent. His newfound abilities were both a blessing and a curse. They provided him with a potent new tool in his fight against the shadowy organization, allowing him to anticipate their movements, uncover their secrets, and even subtly manipulate events to his advantage. He could sense their presence even when they tried to remain hidden, feel their intentions long before they acted on them.